The American consciousness holds a specific sanitized image of the name Johnson & Johnson. It is a name evoked in the quiet sanctity of a nursery, a name printed on the sterile wrappers of bandages that have bound the wounds of soldiers in every major conflict since the Spanish-American War. It is a brand synonymous with care, purity, and the gentle scent of baby powder. Yet beneath the polished veneer of this industrial colossus, behind the manicured hedges of New Jersey's most exclusive estates, lies a narrative far removed from the gentle imagery of the company's marketing. It is a story of a dynasty that conquered the microbial world but failed to cure its own internal rot. To understand the dark gravity of the Johnson family mansion, specifically the colossal, controversially opulent estate known as Jasna Polana, one must first exhume the foundations of a fortune so vast it warped the reality of those born into it. The tragedy did not begin with the laying of marble floors in the 1970s. It began a century earlier, in the cold logic of the factory floor, where the pursuit of sterility inadvertently bred a chaotic and toxic family dynamic. The genesis of this American aristocracy dates back to 1886, a time when medicine was a gruesome game of chance and infection was the silent killer stalking every surgical ward. Robert Wood Johnson along with his brothers, saw not just a business opportunity but a moral imperative in the theories of Joseph Lister. They sought to mass-produce the future of hygiene. But the accumulation of wealth on such an unprecedented scale requires a certain hardness of spirit, a relentless drive that often leaves little room for the soft, nurturing instincts the company sold to the public. As the company grew, transforming New Brunswick, New Jersey into a company town, the Johnson family began their ascent into the stratosphere of the Gilded Age elite. However, the true architect of the dynasty's golden cage was not the founder, but his son, Robert Wood Johnson II, known simply and fearfully as the General. It was under his iron-fisted reign that the family fortune metastasized into billions, and it was his terrifying shadow that would darken the lives of the third generation, setting the stage for the construction of mansions that were less homes and more monuments to unresolved trauma. The General ran the corporation with military precision and approached fatherhood with the same cold calculation. He was a man who believed in strength, in the primal supremacy of the capable, and he looked upon his son, J. Seward Johnson Sr., with a gaze of withering disappointment. Seward, who would one day build the infamous Jasna Polana estate, was born into a world of crushing expectations. Unlike his brother, who ascended to the corporate throne, Seward was viewed as the weak link in a chain forged of steel. He was sensitive, artistic, and fundamentally ill-equipped for the cutthroat boardroom battles his father thrived in. This rejection by the patriarch is the psychological cornerstone of the entire Johnson tragedy. When a child is given unlimited resources but denied validation, the result is often a desperate, lifelong search for comfort, found in the arms of varied lovers in the haze of substance, and in the erection of architectural fortresses designed to keep the world at bay. By the mid-20th century, the Johnson wealth had become abstract, a force of nature that allowed family members to drift entirely disconnected from the reality of the working man. They inhabited a series of grand estates in the Princeton area, properties that were stately, tasteful, and undeniably old money. These early homes were designed to blend into the landscape of American aristocracy, whispering their wealth rather than shouting it. But beneath the surface of polite society dinners and equestrian pursuits, the family was fracturing. Seward Johnson's life became a chaotic cycle of failed marriages and scandal. He was a man drifting through the ocean of his inheritance, seeking an anchor. His eventual entanglement with his Polish chambermaid, Basia Piasecka, would not only scandalize the rigid social hierarchy of New Jersey, but would lead to the construction of a mansion that stood as a defiant physical manifestation of the family's unraveling. The architecture of a dynasty usually reflects its values. The early Johnson homes reflected stability and Protestant work ethics. But as the decades wore on, and as the control of the fortune passed to a generation traumatized by the general's coldness and spoiled by his money, the architecture shifted. It moved toward the grotesque. The story of the Johnson family is not merely a tale of rich people behaving badly. It is a Shakespearean tragedy about the corrosive nature of unearned wealth. As we approach the era of Seward Johnson's twilight years, we see the formation of a perfect storm: a senile patriarch, a fiercely ambitious young wife, and a collection of children who felt cheated of their birthright. This tension would eventually solidify into brick and mortar. The mansion that would become the epicenter of the most expensive will contest in American history was not just a house, it was a weapon. It was built on the ruins of family unity, designed to exclude the children of the previous marriages, and constructed to house an art collection that was worth more than the gross domestic product of small nations. As we peel back the layers of this history, we must look closely at the Johnson curse. It is a term often whispered in tabloids, referring to the uncanny frequency of premature deaths, drug overdoses, and freak accidents that plagued the clan. From motorcycle crashes to solitary deaths in rented rooms, the Johnson heirs seemed hunted by their own fortune. But looking deeper, one sees that the curse was not supernatural, it was structural. It was the result of a family culture that substituted intimacy with trust funds and parental guidance with legal counsel. The isolation of their upbringing, sealed away behind high gates and long driveways, created a vacuum where dysfunction could flourish unchecked. The upcoming construction of Jasna Polana would serve as the ultimate symbol of this isolation. A walled fortress of limestone and marble, impenetrable to the public and the estranged family alike, hiding the dying breaths of a tycoon and the machinations of those fighting for his empire. To understand the sudden tectonic shift in the Johnson dynasty's trajectory, one must examine the arrival of Barbara Basia Piaseca. She did not enter the story through the front doors of high society, nor was she introduced at a debutante ball. She arrived in 1968 as a Polish immigrant with barely a grasp of the English language, carrying a master's degree in art history but fleeing the grim realities of the Iron Curtain. She took employment in the Johnson household not as an equal, but as a chambermaid, hired to cook and clean in the shadow of Seward Johnson's second marriage to Esther Underwood. The dynamic was positively feudal. Yet Basia possessed a fire and an intellectual intensity that the aging, driftless Seward found intoxicating. In her, he saw a vitality that had been drained from his own life by decades of passive luxury. Their affair was clandestine, explosive, and ultimately transformative. When Seward divorced Esther to marry Basia in 1971, he did not just change wives, he changed his entire reality. He was 76 years old, she was 34. The scandal rippled through the conservative enclave of Princeton like a shockwave, turning the quiet whispers of the country club set into a roar of disapproval. With Basia came a vision. She was not content to merely inhabit the existing structures of the Johnson wealth. She intended to redefine them. She saw Seward not as a failed businessman, but as a patron of the arts, a Medici prince waiting for his palace. Thus began the conception of Jasna Polana, a name translating to bright glade in Polish. It was to be built on the grounds of Seward's existing estate, but the old house, a perfectly serviceable grand mansion, was deemed insufficient. In a move that signaled the couple's total break from reality, they demolished the existing home to make way for a neoclassical behemoth that would rival the royal residences of Europe. This was not merely construction. It was an act of dominance. The project would eventually cost over $25 million in the 1970s, an astronomical sum, equivalent to nearly $140 million today, making it the most expensive private residence in America at the time. The construction of Jasna Polana was a slow, agonizing spectacle that played out before the horrified eyes of the Johnson children. While Seward poured his inheritance into limestone and gold leaf, his children from his first two marriages were spiraling into the dark gravity of the Johnson curse. The juxtaposition was cruel and stark. As the walls of the mansion rose, fortified against the outside world, the lives of the heirs were crumbling. Keith Johnson, Seward's son, struggled with addiction, eventually dying of a cocaine overdose. His daughter, Mary Lee, was trapped in a cycle of abusive relationships and financial chaos. They watched from the periphery as their father, who had often been emotionally absent, became physically inaccessible, sequestered behind the rising gates of his new fortress. The mansion became a physical manifestation of their inheritance being consumed block by the stepmother they loathed. They dubbed the staff at the estate the Polish Mafia, convinced that Basia was isolating Seward, feeding his senility, and rewriting his will to cut them out entirely. Architecturally, Jasna Polana was a masterpiece of excess, designed by the renowned architect Wallace K. Harrison, who had helped design Rockefeller Center and the United Nations headquarters. This was significant. The man who built symbols of global diplomacy was now building a private tomb for a dying dynasty. The house was shaped in a U-plan, centering around a massive courtyard. It featured an indoor saltwater swimming pool, a room of the violently insane, a grimly named game room, and air-conditioned doghouses. But the true soul of the house was the art. Basia and Seward embarked on a spending spree that shook the global art market. They acquired pieces by Raphael, Botticelli, and Rembrandt, transforming the home into a high-security vault. The mansion was no longer a home, it was a museum for a curator of one. The irony was palpable, a house built for display that almost no one was allowed to see. The windows were bulletproof, the security systems military grade. It was a golden cage designed to keep the world out, but more importantly, to keep the aging Seward in. As the 1980s dawned, the atmosphere inside Jasna Polana turned gothic. Seward Johnson was deteriorating physically and mentally, battling cancer and the ravages of age. The house, still teeming with workmen and curators, became a stage for a macabre play. The children were largely barred from entry, forced to make appointments to see their own father, often supervised by Basia or her staff. Reports from inside the mansion described a surreal existence where the dying tycoon was wheeled from room to gaze at old masters he could arguably no longer appreciate. The old money code of silence was breaking down. The town of Princeton, usually discreet, buzzed with rumors of shouting matches, of a frantic race to finish the house before Seward died, and of the frantic signing of codicils, legal amendments to the will, that systematically stripped the children of their legacy and transferred the bulk of the estate to Basia. The mansion, intended to be a monument to their love, was rapidly becoming the centerpiece of a war zone. It stood as a monolithic reminder that in the Johnson family, love was a commodity, and inheritance was a weapon to be wielded by the last person standing. The silence that fell over Jasna Polana on May 23, 1983, was heavier than the limestone walls that enclosed it. J. Seward Johnson Sr. was dead at the age of 87. He died not as a titan of industry surrounded by a loving legacy, but as a withered man isolated in his fortress, clutching the hand of a wife 42 years his junior. The funeral was a surreal tableau of tension. The children, estranged and embittered, stood across the grave from Basia Piasecka Johnson, the former maid who now held the keys to the kingdom. But the true violence of the moment was not physical, it was bureaucratic. When the will was finally revealed, it landed with the force of a nuclear detonation. The document, signed in the final, foggy days of Seward's life, was a masterstroke of exclusion. It left the entirety of his estate, valued at roughly $400 million, including the mansion and the priceless art collection, to Basia. The children, the direct descendants of the Johnson & Johnson founders, were left with practically nothing from this specific estate, save for the trusts established years prior which, while substantial to a commoner, were insulting crumbs to the heirs of an empire. The reaction was immediate and scorched earth. The 6 Johnson children, a fractured group plaguing with their own personal demons, united under a single banner of outrage. They filed suit in the New York Surrogates Court, initiating what would become the most expensive, sensational, and vicious will contest in American history. The case in re estate of Johnson was not merely a legal dispute. It was a public autopsy of the family's darkest secrets. The children's legal team, led by the formidable Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, painted a harrowing picture of life inside Jasna Polana. They alleged that their father had not been of sound mind, that he was a senile, frightened man held captive by a tyrannical younger wife who used abuse, intimidation, and isolation to force his hand. The narrative they spun for the jury was Gothic horror, a dying old man trapped in a golden cage, signing away his legacy to stop the screaming. The trial transformed the Surrogates Court in Manhattan into a theater of the grotesque. Day after day, the jury was fed stories that shattered the sterile, wholesome image of the Johnson & Johnson brand. Witnesses testified to Basia's explosive temper, claiming she would scream at the frail Seward, calling him a gaga old man and threatening to leave him if he did not capitulate to her demands. The Polish mafia, the staff loyal to Basia, were depicted as jailers. The mansion itself, Jasna Polana, was recontextualized not as a home, but as a crime scene where a slow-motion psychological murder had taken place. The children's lawyers argued that the architectural grandeur was a facade, a distraction designed to hide the manipulation occurring within the master suite. Every marble slab and Botticelli painting was scrutinized as a fruit of the poisoned tree, purchased with money siphoned from a man who no longer knew the value of $1. Conversely, Basia's defense team, the powerhouse firm Sullivan & Cromwell, launched a brutal counter-offensive. They turned the mirror back onto the children. They portrayed the Johnson heirs not as victims, but as vultures circling the dying carcass of a father they had ignored for years. They argued that Seward had been perfectly lucid and that his decision to disinherit his children was a rational, deliberate act, a final judgment on their failures, their greed, and their lack of character. They painted a picture of Seward finding late-life happiness with Basia, the only person who truly cared for him, while his children waited impatiently for him to die so they could cash out. The courtroom became a bloodsport arena where the definition of sanity and love were debated at billing rates of $500 an hour. As the trial dragged on for months, generating millions of pages of documents, the Jasna Polana estate stood silent in Princeton, a massive, empty symbol of the conflict. It was stuck in legal purgatory. The art could not be sold, the furniture could not be moved. It was a suspended reality. The public devoured the details, the stories of Seward's alleged drug use, the scandalous details of the children's affairs, the sheer, unadulterated venom between the factions. It was a spectacle that highlighted the hidden cost of the dynasty, the complete erosion of privacy and dignity. The Johnson name, once stamped on life-saving sterile sutures, was now being dragged through the mud of tabloid gossip. The culmination of the trial approached not with a bang, but with the exhaustion of all parties involved. The legal fees alone were devouring the very fortune they were fighting over, costing over $24 million, a record at the time. It became clear that if they continued, the lawyers would be the only ones to win. The gavel never fell on the final verdict of In re estate of Johnson. Just as the jury prepared to retire to deliberate on the fate of the $400 million fortune, a hush descended over the courtroom, a different kind of silence than the one that had permeated the trial. The lawyers, exhausted titans of the bar, announced a settlement. It was an anticlimactic, yet inevitable conclusion to a war of attrition. The terms were a study in Pyrrhic victory. Basia Piasecka Johnson retained the lion's share of the estate, walking away with over $300 million and clear title to Jasna Polana. The children, who had fought to prove their father's incompetence, accepted a payout of roughly $40 million to be split among them, a sum that, after taxes and the astronomical legal fees, amounted to a fraction of the empire they had sought to reclaim. The settlement was an admission that no one could survive the scrutiny of a verdict. The children secured their dignity but lost the war. Basia kept the fortress but lost her reputation, branded forever in the public eye as the maid who married the boss. With the legal armies dispersed, Basia returned to Jasna Polana, now the undisputed queen of a hollow kingdom. For the next 2 decades, the mansion served as one of the most paradoxical residences in America. It was a palace of breathtaking beauty, filled with art that rivaled the Uffizi, yet it was inhabited by a solitary figure and her staff. Basia threw herself into philanthropy, perhaps seeking redemption or perhaps simply seeking a legacy distinct from the scandal. She poured millions into Poland, supporting the Solidarity movement and funding art restoration. Yet the mansion itself seemed to reject domesticity. It was too vast, too charged with the negative energy of its conception. The room of the violently insane and the marble corridors echoed with the silence of a dynasty that had ceased to function as a family. The house was a museum of grief, a gilded cage that Seward had built to die in and where Basia now lived to remember him. In a final twist that underscores the commodification of the American dream, the ultimate fate of Jasna Polana was not to crumble into ruin like the estates of the Great Gatsby era, but to be repurposed for leisure. Realizing that the estate was too massive for any single private individual to maintain, and perhaps too burdened with ghosts, Basia made a decision in the late 1990s that shocked the Princeton elite once again. She partnered with the PGA Tour to convert the estate into a Tournament Players Club (TPC). The transformation was surgical and symbolic. The manicured gardens where Seward had wheeled in his final days were carved into fairways. The behemoth mansion was converted into a clubhouse for the wealthy elite. Today, golfers sip scotch in the rooms where the Johnson family disintegrated, walking across the marble floors where the Polish mafia once stood guard. The exclusivity remains, but the intimacy of the tragedy has been paved over by the generic luxury of country club membership. Basia Piasecka Johnson died in Poland in 2013, leaving behind a complicated legacy. The art collection, the very soul of the mansion, was dismantled. In a series of high-profile auctions at Sotheby's and Christie's, the Rembrandts and Raphaels were scattered to the winds, purchased by hedge fund managers and anonymous oligarchs. The Johnson collection ceased to exist as a unified entity, much like the family itself. The dispersion of the art was the final act of the dynasty's dissolution. What remains is the brand, Johnson & Johnson, still ubiquitous, still sterile, still projecting an image of care. And there is the mansion standing on the Princeton Ridge, a beautiful repurposed shell. It stands as a monument to the hidden cost of the Johnson fortune, the reality that money can build walls thick enough to keep the world out, but it cannot build a home that can withstand the rot from within. The story of the Johnson and Johnson dynasty, and specifically the saga of Jasna Polana, serves as a dark mirror to the American success story. It challenges the conflation of wealth with well-being. From the antiseptic factories of Robert Wood Johnson I to the chaotic courtroom battles of his grandchildren, the narrative arc is one of entropy. The cursed dynasty was not brought down by external enemies or market crashes, but by the cold vacuum of emotional neglect. As the sun sets over the manicured greens of the TPC Jasna Polana, the shadows lengthen over a house that destroyed a marriage, bankrupted a family's trust, and proved with brutal finality that while you can inherit a fortune, you cannot inherit peace.